We're going to begin this course with a trip to the grocery store where we can see the statistical process in action. But before we go, we're going to take a minute to explore this concept of data. Now, if you've done any reading on statistics at all, you know that statistics is the science of obtaining data, analyzing data, and drawing conclusions from data. So data is the foundation of statistics. Without data, we would have no need for statistics. So what is data? What do we mean when we say data? Well, when we talk about data, we sometimes call data variables, and you'll see why in a minute. We mean the information that we collect from individuals. So by information, we mean values that measure, count, or categorize characteristics of individuals. And of course, these values vary from individual to individual. Now, if the values measure or count, we call them numerical data or quantitative data. If they categorize, we call them categorical data. Or sometimes qualitative data. When it comes to individuals, the first thing that comes to your mind might be people. And individuals can be people, but it can be so much more. We can also study animals, objects, events, and on the list goes. So what does all of this have to do with the grocery store? Well, when my daughter Anna was much younger, she's an adult now, teaching in Washington, D.C., so very proud of her, keeping the family tradition of being a teacher. When she was much younger, when she was in elementary school and maybe junior high school, she loved grapes. Now, as a mother, that made me very happy. I would much rather she loved grapes than chips or M&Ms or something like that. So I was always willing to buy grapes at the grocery store, even though sometimes they were quite expensive. But the agreement was if I bought grapes, Anna had to eat them all. We weren't going to buy the expensive grapes and throw them away. I thought that was pretty reasonable on my part. So Anna quite intuitively developed the statistical process for making good decisions about when to buy grapes and when not to buy grapes because they weren't going to be the type that she wanted to eat. So her process consisted of these steps. First, we would go into the store and we would go over to the produce department and we would survey the population. Now, the population is all of the individuals of interest. So the population would be all of the bunches of grapes that were on the display in the produce department that were available for sale. After surveying the population, she would select a sampling frame. Now, a sampling frame is the collection of individuals that can be selected for our sample. So she would select a bunch of grapes that looked especially good to her. Once she selected the sampling frame, now in this case, the sampling frame was a portion of the population, and it could change. If that first bunch of grapes didn't look good, she might try another sampling frame. But in a statistical process, sometimes a sampling frame is the entire population, sometimes it's a subset of the population, something that we need to be careful of when we're drawing conclusions from the data that we've collected. So she selects a sampling frame, which in this case is a bunch of grapes. And so she looks over the individuals. The individuals in this case are grapes. So I'll add that to our list up here, one of the objects that we can study. And she would select a sample. she would kind of randomly select some grapes. So let's say she chose this one, she chose this little one up here, and she chose this one that was not so green there. She did learn through experience that she needed to select a sample that represented the sampling frame or the population. So she would select the little one, she would select the ones that didn't look especially good, because she knew she had to eat them all when she got home, otherwise there was going to be a price to pay. So I'm sure any mother would understand that. So when we select a representative sample is some of the individuals in the population that represent the characteristics of the population as best as we can. So of course she would then collect her data, her information from these grapes, from these individuals. And so some of the variables that she would look at, most of them were categorical variables. She would look at the color. She would taste the grapes to get the flavor and the texture. Were they crunchy? Were they mushy? She would feel the grape to see, how firm it was. And I think those were probably the primary variables that she collected at this time, because that would allow her to know whether whether she was going to be able to eat these grapes before they went bad. And finally, the fifth step, she reached a conclusion. She made a decision based on the data that she had collected. And her decision was, to buy or not to buy. That is the question. So let's talk about this process, which occurs for all of us quite intuitively. We probably didn't know that we were using statistics every time we bought produce at the grocery store or at the farmer's market, but we are. So let's take a look at this in more generic terms. The statistical process usually begins with wanting to know some information about some population. Now, it would be really nice if we could just, you know, get information from every individual in the population. But populations are so large, and many populations that we're interested in are dynamic, that taking a census, which would be to gather information from every single individual in the population, is impossible, quite literally. So we have to select a random sample, just as my daughter did. Now, random samples usually represent the population, so we're not leaving out any main feature of the population in our sample individuals. And of course, in order to get these random representative samples, we need to use special sampling techniques, which will be the topic of our next lesson. So it's not just a convenient sample as my daughter chose, although I think we could argue that that convenient sample that she chose was indeed representative. That's often not the case. We have some very specific techniques that we use to get these representative random samples. Now, by random, we mean that we allow chance to select the individuals for us. We don't choose our favorites, we don't choose our friends, we don't choose the ones that are most convenient and easiest to get. So we use chance in a random sample, and random samples are more likely to represent the population than other types of samples. So once we have our individuals, we collect our data. We get our information from those individuals. And here is where we develop kind of a circle. So we collect the data from the sample. I'm going to bring it over here. We analyze the data and reach a conclusion. And if we're going to be technical, we have to disclose that this conclusion is about the sample, because that's all we have information from. We don't have information from the entire population. We just have information from the sample. So what we do is we infer, we make an assumption, we assume that the sample represents the population, so that what is true about the sample is also true about the entire population. That is why our sampling techniques are so very important. And now we have what we wanted from the very start. We assume that we have the information about the population that started this whole process. So we're coming right back up to here, and we complete the process. So what we see in this inferential model, we call this inferential statistics. We collect we collect data from a sample, analyze the data, reach a conclusion, assume that the sample represents the population, and that the conclusion is indeed the information that we wanted about the population. We're going to spend the entire semester, just about, unraveling this process and looking at it step by step and becoming proficient in utilizing this process and conducting this process for the various situations which require statistical analysis in order to reach good conclusions and decisions.